Why isn't dotnet Core popular among startups? Is there any specific reason why startups, at least here in India, don't tend to use dotnet for backend, especially now dotnet is also open source and cross-platform? My primary source for this observation is the LinkedIn jobs sections, where most of the opening in startups require Java or Node.js for entry-level roles. Especially, what benefits does Java offer to prefer it above dotnet? I am not mentioning Node.js here, as it is understandable that it's more easy to get started with, and the same language can also be used to make front-end. I've been working in startups exclusively over the last 2+ years. 4 total, ranging from seed to Series C, 1-year Combinator startup. It's been relatively easy to transition into TypeScript because of how similar it is to C#, especially on the back end. I proposed C# at one startup for a refactor of a back-end piece where a key goal was to improve throughput over an existing Node implementation. I did not anticipate pushback because I submitted my interview project in C# and therefore proposed C# for this piece. In fact, the pushback was so strong that it actually inspired me to write a series of articles on the topic. 1. The case for C# and .NET. 2. 6 .NET myths dispelled. 3. Building up from JavaScript to TypeScript to C#. 4. Getting functional with C#. 5. GitHub repo comparing J's TSCS. I've continuously reflected on this, and here are my working conclusions. 1. Startups tend to skew younger, and younger teams are more comfortable with JavaScript. Many younger founding teams have no formal software engineering backgrounds. One of the startups was founded by ex-traders who had experience working with scripting, but no CS background. 2. Startups tend to work full stack, and JavaScript is better for full stack work. Early life cycle of startups tends to be more full stack compared to mature companies where there is a delineation between front end and back end. It's more cost effective, and there's a need to build both the front and the back simultaneously. With that in consideration, it's more efficient/economical to build in one language and toolset. 3. There's a lot of legacy thinking around C# and .NET. This is in both the .NET dev community, the available resources to hire, and folks who encountered .NET framework at some point in their career, and are now engineering managers/decision makers. I spoke with one engineering manager who was considering Rust or Go for their rewrite target as they moved parts of their system off of Node. It struck me as odd, given that C# is a natural extension from TypeScript given its converging object-functional hybrid nature. But many .NET devs haven't embraced that shift, and many folks who may have in the past touched .NET framework aren't aware of the shift to open source and the object-functional creep from F#. 4. Tainted image from a few bad decisions. A few high-profile decisions in the .NET ecosystem have had an outsized impact on the perception of the platform and FOSS-iness of the .NET community. The .NET Watch fiasco. The shift from OmniSharp to DevKit. A few OSS missteps along the way. Teams see these being discussed on Hacker News, for example, but rarely follow the longer-tail development of the platform. Watch works fine from the command line and VSC. 5. .NET's more convention-based approach is harder to grasp. That's why I think minimal APIs are good for the community in general, since they are less convention-based. Young dev teams want to move fast and are reliant on the tooling to provide just-in-time knowledge. The problem with convention-oriented frameworks, for example attribute decorators on function parameters, is that such functionality is not visible unless you're already familiar with the framework design. For that reason, Fluent-style APIs and parameter-oriented design is better than convention. Because JavaScript hasn't formalized the decorators spec, you don't tend to see as much convention-oriented frameworks in JS, like Nest.js. Whereas ASP.NET, F, etc., are heavily attribute-based and therefore require more knowledge to use. This is especially true when working with JSON and serialization in C# versus in JS. 6. Competition for human resources. Startups have very high resource churn for a variety of reasons. The challenge with .NET right now is that the folks with experience in .NET tend to work in an enterprise environment. So a startup is competing with enterprises for resources, and this can be a difficult challenge since startups can't offer the same types of benefits and stability as an enterprise. 7. Fear of multi-threading. Node object lifecycles are really easy to manage since everything is effectively single-threaded and singleton. As soon as you switch to .NET or Java, now you need to think about object lifetimes, resource sharing, locking, and so on. If you're already used to these concepts, it seems like a trivial thing. But many devs who are node-only have never thought about things like singleton versus transient versus scoped lifecycles in Node. They've never had to think about ownership and lock contention. 8. Disdain for OOP. There is an undercurrent of backlash against OOP for some reason. A big shift towards functional programming paradigms, perhaps driven by React's shift to the functional hooks model. C# and Java are seen through this lens. For me, I don't see FP solving the key challenges, bad programmers, but FP is the current silver bullet that's being sold. I think the reality is that schools are just really, really bad at teaching OOP. 9. Every engineering team I worked on at startups was Mac-based. It was the odd dev that used Windows, and even in most cases, they eventually switched to Mac. The .NET dev community is still heavily Windows-focused because of its adoption in enterprise, which tends to be Windows-oriented for systems management reasons. Despite the fact that .NET works great on Mac, I switched to Mac for all of my work, .NET included, so there's a bit of perception that .NET is Windows only or that .NET doesn't work as well on Mac and Linux. 10. There's a line of thinking that C# and Java are too mainstream. I first encountered this while interviewing for a startup that was using ReScript on the front end and Reason on the back end. The founder's thought process is that this is self-selection in a good way. More recently, an interview with Griffin's founder on why he chose Clojure stated this more concretely: given a C# or Java job listing, you might have a pool of 15 great candidates out of 150 applicants. A Go listing, you might see 10 great candidates out of 50 applicants. Rust, Clojure, Reason, or some other fringe language? You might be looking at 5 candidates out of 15. For startups, the benefit is that they spend less time finding the few great candidates. I'm a big believer that .NET and C# are currently the best step-up option for teams that need to grow beyond Node. Rust and Go are a bigger leap from Js/TS, whereas C# seems like a small step in comparison. I think it will take time, and the .NET community needs to also embrace the shifting .NET and C# landscape. From my experience, item 3 seems to be the biggest one. .NET Framework left a bad taste in lots of devs' mouths, but there's also a lot of devs who liked it but haven't really moved into more modern .NET. The issue with the last group is they still tend to think, we need to Microsoft all the things for this to really work. So that means SQL Server, Azure, possibly DevOps. Visual Studio Pro is the only editor one should even consider, and why would anyone even consider using the command line to do things when Vercys gives you some nice GUIs? Further, the concept of separated concerns for front-end and back-end also seems foreign, as I still see questions about how to implement React with MVC Razor pages and whatnot. My previous employer did a huge rewrite that they wrapped up just before I joined, so I really got to see what a more modern .NET shop looked like, and it was glorious. New devs got Macs and things worked well enough on them, did have a hiccup with a new NuGet package a Windows dev introduced not having ARM binaries, got resolved in a week, the CLI tooling was absolutely solid, everything ran locally in Docker, and they even used the new minimal API structure for things. They even used Fcore with lots of success. .NET in general is just in a really weird spot right now, with older devs who cut their teeth on framework and haven't really been keeping up to date with the latest features of .NET and development in general, and a new generation of devs who, as you point out, cut their teeth on JS or Java. I do think Microsoft hasn't helped out as well as they could/should have in this regard, but there's always room for improvement. I do think it'll come down to how well Microsoft presents things and builds up understanding of the new ways of net, though. Versus is absolutely not mandatory for net. Some say Rider is better. VSC is also capable of doing net, I'm aware of that, but lots of old school net engineers seem to think Versus is the only choice for true net development. I actually had a conversation about this at my current client assignment when I noted it's kind of annoying the projects they have only ideally run inside Visual Studio at the moment, and should be designed to run with any editor as modern net allows for that. They viewed it as more and nice to have and ended with, honestly, if you're doing net you're just going to default to Visual Studio. It was brought up by another consultant that things would also run better under Linux using the right Docker containers, which would also help with the release process as we move them further towards proper C/CD processes. They still didn't seem to really see the point. And that's kind of the crux of item 3 from this guy's list and my own arguments for what's holding net back at the moment. Old guard mentalities about things coupled with newer/younger engineers not knowing what's possible and being told incorrect information by old guard net engineers. I'm aware of that, but lots of old school net engineers seem to think Versus is the only choice for true net development. Yeah, we kind of do. It's a bit to do with way it was introduced and also the heavier use of command line. Unix-based system devs might like their command lines, Windows. Net devs not so much. Windows environment has spent 30 plus years, and Versus nearly same amount, trying to get away from command lines as much as possible, coming out with something that uses it so much kind of goes against the grain. Really, even though I mix and match more now, if project I will be working on will be exclusively net, I cannot think of a good reason to use code over Versus. I only use code if not net or mix. I completely migrated to CLI as soon as Windows Terminal was released. I do all build/run/test/debug stuff via CLI. It helps to understand what dependencies your project uses and in what way, and speeds up troubleshooting things in the remote environments, C/CD, VMs, containers. And it's just nice to be able to grab a new laptop, run 1 to 2 commands, and have your whole environment set up, IDE, Git, other tools. And then run git clone and dotnet run and everything just works. A new dev can start coding on day 1. Yep, coupled with a package manager to install any other tooling one might need, the CLI really lets you get shit done quickly. Here's a doc, run these commands to install your tools, clone the repos, and run the projects. Let us know if you have any questions. Microsoft is moving strongly towards command line and PowerShell now. There is a CLI and commandlets for pretty much everything, including all Azure configuration. Right, and to be clear, if I wasn't already, I am in no way against devs using Visual Studio if that's what they prefer. I just don't think things should be built in such a way that it's the only viable option when working on a codebase, particularly anything new or built within the last, say, 3 to 5 years. Personally, I feel Visual Studio feels bloated in this day and age, and have come around on using the command line for lots of things, though I can certainly appreciate a good GUI. Versus code's conflict resolution for Git is top-notch. I'd argue, though, that Microsoft adding WSL is kinda sort of them admitting that there's lots of devs who really do like Linux tooling, and even PowerShell has been updated to more closely match how Bash works, plus they have Wingit for package management now. Honestly think most places would benefit from using a package manager of some sort to help devs get environments set up super quickly. PWSH is the best way to work with CLI. Less cryptic than Bash, has a lot more functionality out of the box, and has full access to the dotnet SDK. It's also less verbose when it comes to functions and reusable code. The cool part is that all dotnet Docker images include it by default, and all SICT pipelines have it as an option instead of plain shell or bash. PWSH is the best way to work with CLI. Less cryptic than Bash, has a lot more functionality out of the box, and has full access to the dotnet SDK. It's also less verbose when it comes to functions and reusable code. VSC is also capable of doing net, I exclusively code C# in VSC. Once in a while, I think about renewing my rider license, totally worth it, by the way, because I miss some of the far superior refactoring tooling. Personally, after using Rider, I do not want to ever even see Verses installed on my PC. It's so much better in every way. What's the front end for your precious employer's software product? It seems pretty cool that everyone gets to run local Docker for development. .NET in general is just in a really weird spot right now, with older devs who cut their teeth on framework and haven't really been keeping up to date with the latest features of .NET and development in general. That was me to a certain extent, but got involved in a project where I needed to implement a web API, started with minimal API, really liked that, got into Dapper and dependency injection, then moved to F, something I used to hate, but got the hang of it, wouldn't move back now. Huge speed up in dev time. Burning my brains on implementing OAuth 2 authentication right now. Azure B2C is a real mind fuck. Once it works, it's great that the docs suck ass, especially if you're trying to do stuff even mildly outside the box. Great list, and I learned something new. As a C# developer for over 20 years, number 6 is why I don't even bother to look at startups. Their compensation is pathetic compared to what an established company will give, and even what it is on par. I have no interest in working in a place that will eventually burn through its VC payday and start doing shitty things to their employees to save every penny. What an amazing summary, thank you. I'm a senior .NET dev/architect manning an interim role as a CTO in a Go startup, and your 10 conclusions really resonate with my experience so far. The dev team is quite young/junior across the board, only a few have a formal degree, and I get the impression that to them C# and Java are meme languages for old people. Meanwhile, development moves at an absolutely glacial pace because after only 3 years the amount of tech debt this shop has managed to pile up in the backend alone just boggles the mind. I'm not going to sudo a rewrite in .NET though, there's no way that would be cost effective on a reasonable timescale. But wow, there's so much shitty Go code and reinvented wheels that could be tossed out if we did. I get the impression that to them C# and Java are meme languages for old people, disdain for OOP. There is an undercurrent of backlash against OOP for some reason. A big shift towards functional programming paradigms, perhaps driven by React's shift to the functional hooks model. C# and Java are seen through this lens. For me, I don't see FP solving the key challenges, bad programmers, but FP is the current silver bullet that's being sold. I think the reality is that schools are just really, really bad at teaching OOP. This isn't my hatred against C# or .NET but more against Java. If you have ever had a utility class or worse a utility namespace, you know what I mean. Because everything has to be in a class, we have some terrible code. And we have even more terrible programmers. Not just the young ones, the experienced ones are also just as bad if not worse. Completely agree with everything you said. I would add there is a fear of licensing cost on .NET Studio. Most startups don't want to buy a MSDN license. They don't actually Google its free tier. I feel like you touched on it, but to be really blunt, ego-driven young developers don't think it's cool. They completely overestimate their abilities to pick up Rust, Go, Python, good JavaScript. Although I understand the appeal towards new hot techs, such as Rust, Go or even J's, I think it would be way easier for junior devs and startup to build their stack with a framework that actually has a well-defined structure and that is easy to scale, such as .NET Core. Yeah, Go is a great language, and I totally love Go. But designing well the structure of your app for scalability requires experience junior devs don't have, and Go being super flexible means there is no predefined structure in a project. Same goes for JavaScript. Heard so many stories about having to rewrite an entire front end because their React app structure became a clusterfuck with time. All that said, I hope startups will see the benefits of adopting .NET early, especially for their backend, for its predefined structure, scalability, verbosity etc. As A+, it's quite easy to get started quickly in .NET, thanks to F-Core and validation decorators. Totally agree. That structure may be verbose, but it helps long term. Yes, this is a big-time misconception and one of the reasons I hope Microsoft invests more in VS Code tooling for C# while keeping it as open and free as possible. They don't actually Google its free tier. There really is no free tier for business. Community and Pro is the exact same product with the distinction that you are disallowed from using Community if your company has more than 5 developers. So free only works for extremely small startups. So their license concern is valid. But it's not terribly expensive and they could use VS Code or Rider. What's the most expensive possible standard versus license? $3,000 per user per year? School fails to teach how to design an app properly around OOP, structs and inheritance, leading to too much abstraction, making the code harder to understand, code repetition, etc. But to be fair, with a field so vast as IT, designing is a skill you get with experience rather than being taught. At my job startup, we're currently in the midst of transitioning our C#/.NET 6 backend to TypeScript. Somewhat related to point number 6, many C# devs have spent their entire careers in enterprise environments. While there might be competent devs, enterprise roles typically revolve around working on mature systems. As a result, I've noticed that a lot of C# devs lack experience in bootstrapping new projects, which is important experience to have if you're going to be working at a startup. Need to introduce those devs to the bootstrap templates that help to set up a lot of boilerplate with a single command smile. I mean, it's more than just project boilerplate templates too. It's also project structure/architecture, deployments, configuring logging, setting up auth, and getting just that first iteration of the app out the door. Previously, I worked in the IT department of a large insurance company, and all of those things were set up by consultants years before I joined the company. The in-house devs just worked on incremental updates and bug fixes. A friend of mine worked for a bank, and it was a similar story. It isn't hard to learn those things, but at some companies, there may not be any opportunities to practice those things on the job. Most of my career I went through similar teams where we'd work on 10+ years old code bases and never done anything from scratch. When I needed to actually create an app from the ground up, I also had a lot of problems with how to approach it. Now I have a template that I use to set up the initial structure, code standards. Editor config, setup for logging, Swagger, DB, with different presets for different types of DBs, clients, validation, architecture with a split into presentation/business logic/infra/shared code. It also set up Docker file and GitHub Action YAML file. 30 seconds of setup and I'm ready to create the initial 10 API endpoints within the first day. Initial infra setup is also easy via common templates for Bicep, Azure, AWS CDK, Terraform, whatever the project currently requires. Very good question. The only thing that even remotely would make sense for that to me is if they wanted a unified language for everything, which if you have an explicit front-end and back-end, would mean you have dedicated front-end and back-end devs, right? Strange decision. Great post. Thanks for sharing your insight. I'm one of those guys who is stuck in the enterprise. I interviewed for a startup and I was inches from accepting the offer but backed out because of fear of stability, exactly like you suggested. Why risk working for a company that could fold overnight and working 60 hours a week for 20% more money when I put in a soft 38 for 6 figures already? 4 should possibly include fear of being silverlighted. 1. MS recently rebranded Xamarin to Maui with some odd issues along the way. 2. MS recently decided to kill Verses for Mac. 3. MS messaging regarding Maui support. .NET 6 is not LTS with Maui even though their logic for comforting potential users is Maui is part of .NET. Support/LTS is kind of a joke anyway considering how only the latest patch is actually supported and a specific example. Net 7/C number 11 support the required keyword, but the fix for an exception is only included in the Net 8/preview version. I personally dislike the grand November release that either includes partial features or forces us to wait another year. We all understand that developing robust software is difficult, but MS communication regarding bugs and decisions is often condescending. I love .NET/C#, but I can see why other developers would want to steer clear. So do you believe that the market share and demand for .NET Stack would rise in the coming future or decline? I am asking this from a career point of view, although I am aware that core software engineering skills are much more important than a language or a stack, but this absence of .NET in startup worries me. I think it will rise primarily because there are signs of node fatigue, but I think that the startup space sees more appeal, for lack of a better term, in Rust and Go. Partially because many founding engineers tend to come from other companies already using Rust or Go and fewer are coming from companies using .NET/C#. So C# and .NET will see increased interest and adoption in startups, but so will Rust and Go, and those are likely to see more growth than .NET/C#. It is not a logical decision since C# is a better match for teams coming off of JS/TS, but it's what I see. You have to convince a team that .NET/C# are the right choice. It absolutely is, given how similar it is to TypeScript, while the decision makers on the teams are already self-inclined to investigate Rust or Go. For what is worth, I think Rust is too niche/hard to even make a dent in C#/Go market share. It can't really compete with all the quality of life you get with GC languages/runtime such as Go, C# and TypeScript. Not to mention Rust culture is to have a lean standard library in favor of third-party libraries. There's a crate for everything. Which is understandable for a systems language. But it is not desirable for churning out web apps in a maintainable way. Go and C# have a large standard library developed by two industry behemoths. That alone is a lot of free wins, and with .NET even the third-party libraries are so well done. XUnit, Dapper, Serilog, Mediatre, Swagger, Mudblazer, the list goes on for miles. Very well documented and robust libraries that are supported by an enthusiastic community. Your points are all true, but it's the hot thing right now, so there are a lot of teams looking at Rust while ignoring C#, even though it would be a better back-end choice. I think it will rise primarily because there are signs of node fatigue. Think it will remain the same. Startups will always jump on the next new thing. Currently anything that can be used to slap AI on the product, it's part of their image to investors, and MS Tech never has been and never will be sexy enough to be a selling point. Meanwhile, larger established companies will continue to use Java or .NET because of their track record, established tooling and available talent pool. As you said, startups want to cut down their talent pool to draw on, larger companies want it maximized. The saying in big companies is as true today as it was 25 years ago: no one ever get fired for implementing a Microsoft solution, except Elon Musk obviously, but then Confinity/PayPal was just a startup then. Regarding number 8, disdain for OOP. Having written OOP-style code my entire life, using C++ and C#, I agree with your statements. However, as a startup, I would think that OOP would not be my first choice, as change would seem a bit harder, especially if using inheritance patterns. I tend to think startups just want, essentially, proof of concept code, and FP seems like it would fit slightly better. Or, am I wrong? I think it's a bit more nuanced. Startups aren't writing true FP, firstly because JS itself isn't a true FP language. What they actually end up doing is more akin to static methods on a static class in C#. This is effectively the same thing as exporting a function in JS. Most of the engs I worked with wouldn't be able to tell you what a monad is or why / when / how to use currying. In actuality, I think inheritance isn't that different from functional composition, of course, the challenge in C# being single inheritance. But keep in mind, C#'s extension methods effectively allow a sort of function composition paradigm centered around a type or contract. The problem is perception of C# as OOP and JavaScript as FP, and React being such a big influence in the JS ecosystem. In fact, if you look at the core of any big OSS JS projects, you'll actually find OOP. 1. Mongo node drivers. 2. Apollo GQL client. 3. Storybook. 4. Prisma. Many others. 1. Startups tend to underemploy people. Looking at you JavaScript guys, Startups tend to underemploy people. Looking at you JavaScript guys. Did you mean underpay? Because dotnet is like the world champion of underpaying. This was looking at the average salary for developers depending on their stack. Can't believe net is a lower average considering a lot of net devs are seniors compared to average Go dev salary. I don't think there are as many seniors in the Go ecosystem as there is within net. To me, it makes sense Jays has a lower average. There is a lot of junior devs in the Jays ecosystem, but net enterprise jobs tend to be easy and stable. A lot of people, myself included, are willing to take a hit on pay knowing they will have steady employment for as long as they want and they can head to the bar at 3 a couple of times a month. Historical reasons. .NET is a great fit for startups. C# is a really solid language and so is the net ecosystem. There's great tooling support and generous licensing for individuals/small companies. I wouldn't say that net isn't popular, but it certainly has room for image improvements. Again, it's mainly due to historical reasons and stereotypes. Windows only, Microsoft's monopoly, etc. Guess there aren't major reasons other than image related, and that's understandable as I was one of those who would stereotype net until I worked in it, although I do consider net framework as not so good, but Microsoft changed the game with Core. Yes. To be clear, when I write net I mean net Core/new. Net 5 and above, and not the net framework. Understandable. I think we all can agree that net framework sucks, at least today, if not in past. I wish I never touched net framework lol. As a 3-year dev, I thought net was just net core until I got hired at a place that was still using net framework 2.0 with Visual Basic. .NET framework is not bad, but God, I prefer net core design patterns. While tooling can be fairly cheap, the thought of tooling costing anything is a fairly big deterrent. It's hard to compete against free. I mean, do I want to pay $1,100 for Versus Professional or use lackluster tooling of Versus Code? If we had the eclipse of .NET, i.e., completely free and open source IDE that users could pay for improved plugins, I think it would take off. You might have out-of-date information. Right now, Versus Community and Professional are only different in licensing. They have exactly same features. The only difference is that Professional license has to obtained by larger companies. The actual difference is between Community/Professional and Enterprise, but even then those features are just some nice additions that don't really make that much difference in the grand scheme of things. For example, a live unit tests runner. It's basically like in your example with Eclipse, it's free unless you want better plugins/features. Versus Community in its current form is a fully fledged, feature-rich and free IDE that many users of free IDEs for other languages can only dream of, unless they pay. Versus Code is in itself a great IDE, albeit admittedly it does require some plugins for its full potential. With C# Dev Kit for Versus Code, net support is only getting better and better. On top of that, developers get Azure DevOps C/CD tooling, with hosting of repos, build and deployment pipelines, test plans, etc. again, free up to a certain point. The net tooling effectively is free unless you're a large enough company, in which case the licensing costs shouldn't be much of an issue anyway. And noteworthy alternatives do exist. Startups didn't get the memo that .NET is no longer expensive. It isn't? Honest question. Also, C# may not be expensive anymore. But working with, let's say, Node, wouldn't be free of cost, so I think I confused it with the costs of using Visual Studio. I know that the community version is free only for small teams. Small with a lot of air quotes. It can be used if you're under 1M revenue and 250 workers. Ah yes. Visual Studio can get expensive, but there are alternatives out there, not really compared to the cost of a salary and basically any other business cost. Well, you can still use VS Code and Fleet. IDEs are costly though. It isn't. It's free, open source and cross-platform now, so it can be hosted on Linux, just like the nodes of the world. VS Code is free and they are most likely even using it already. Versus 2022 is free for most startups. They would only pay for Windows, which they are probably also already paying for. Anyway, this must be regional. Here in the UK it's used extensively in startups and large companies alike. Here Microsoft shed its bad image long ago. Yeah, that's why I found it important to mention my region, as I might not have a wider view of things. Mine uses it extensively. That said, there is a bit of a stigma coming from two things as far as I can tell. 1. It's for big business, fintech. 2. MSFT's image rehab, around accessibility and open source, hasn't reached everyone. Not sure what more they can do other than stay the course and give ITIL more time, although they did close source of Scode's C# extension. Every one of those moves is a huge step back when people say MSFT will again. Although they did close source of Scode's C# extension, not exactly, though it's complicated. In the C# extension they stopped using the open source implementation OmniSharp to use their own open source Rustlin/LSP implementation. That would have been mostly ignored by the community or even seen as a positive, except that it coincided with the release of DevKit for VS Code. DevKit is proprietary, and its obvious part of the reason MS moved to their own language extension implementation was so that they could share code infrastructure between Vercys and VS Code for some of the advanced language/project features. In other words, it was motivated by Microsoft wanting to sell more Vercys licenses or reduce their Vercys costs. Even if the swap would improve the C# Vercys code extension's performance, which it does, it looked like a conflict of interest, which it was. It was also, incorrectly, announced in angry articles that Microsoft was closing the source of the C# extension, which made many devs angry. In reality, it was only the additional functionality of DevKit, which was not something that existed in Vercys code before. Microsoft didn't handle it well, though the net impact is better tools for MS devs and everything that we had before is still open source. A more legit critique would be that the C# debugger is still closed source. I can't fathom how MS practicing dry can be construed as something that is motivated by selling Vercys licenses. It just seems like they are trying to leverage the decades of experience and tooling with Vercys for their Vercys code extension. Am I missing something crucial here, or was this just blown out of proportion and the timing exacerbated it? Was this just blown out of proportion and the timing exacerbated it? Pretty much this. Microsoft has a recent history of backing down when challenged by the community about their choices related to open source, so they have accidentally taught their dev users and community members to challenge most choices loudly and quickly. In this case, the loudest challenge came from an ex-Microsoft employee, which wasn't a great look. It was motivated by Microsoft wanting to sell more Vercys licenses. This right here is the problem. They are going to keep making these blunders until they stop trying to justify dev costs with software licensing of the tools, like Vercys, that are competing with completely free tools. They should instead see it as the best marketing for Azure that money can buy. They don't need to make a cent from dev directly. Attempts to do so are just handicapping Azure. That's not how things work though. You don't justify the large division that is all of dev with hand-waving and hopes. They need trackable impact with measurable outcomes/revenue pull-through. And that's not possible without things the community wouldn't support, telemetry and other tracking baked in. So your options are to deal with the fact that Vercys makes pretty good money, and the community gets free roll-off in the form of Vercys community/VS Code, or you make your own tools and MS stops investing in them. I don't see any decent open source IDEs that aren't made by MS for C# these days. And don't say mono-develop, I said decent. And what's stopping the community from making their own LSP, or their own debugger? Sometimes OSS communities are so toxic to commercial entities that contribute, when they are getting free tools to use. If you don't like the tools provided, or the licenses they operate under, make your own. That's the OSS way after all. Or they can use a language that already has all that stuff. Note, I'm not bashing C# since I love using it. But I'm trying to make it clear why people won't build an entire LSP because Microsoft doesn't provide one. They don't have the time for that. I mean, most other languages don't have the level of features that C# has for dev without being closed source in nature. J's IDEs are largely paid or are something like VS Code where some commercial company is subsidizing it. Java IDEs are largely paid and just as closed source as MIS. An IDE/LSP is usually a large investment, and thus normally commercialized at some point. What language/ecosystem do you see that has a great OSS IDE with full LSP and debugging support baked in? Genuinely curious. What kind of features? As far as I know, there isn't anything C# can do that others can't. Edit. Oops, I angered the fanboys who think C# is the only language with IntelliSense Lamau. Clear communication. They often let products die and don't even say something about it. I remember Windows Mobile. Less news every month and then it was dead but never communicated. This happens to some other products as well, and even Xamarin was not a good example. Even now, I follow some Copilot issues. Especially with Visual Studio. You would think it's their premium product, but Copilot is worse than on Versus Code or Rider. And communication is like, we fixed some issues, try it now. It's kind of annoying they pulled the Windows containers for SQL Server. The Linux ones work fine enough for local development, but SQL Server still runs best on Windows, so unless you're also running SQL Server in Linux in the cloud, you can't fully emulate your production environments locally with Docker. Personally, it's a reason I tell folks they should just consider using Postgre at this point. As for most CRUD apps, there's little if any reason to use and license SQL Server instead. Is there reason for any app? It's not like Postgre is any less capable than anything else of dealing with large instances. I'm not entirely sure, which is why I limited it to mainly CRUD apps, particularly as the covers like, the vast majority of services out there, smiley face. I mean, if we're being honest, I think some of the community is also stuck in the past. Every announcement of new C# features is met with complaints that the language should have never evolved past version 3 or whatever. 1. We're a Microsoft partner, as such most of our assets are in Azure as C#-based apps, some being in AWS as other tech. 2. Floating point and data types for currency. Can you help me with the second one? What's the problem? It's fair to say that there is a high chance startups will choose JavaScript/TypeScript as their backend tech. Probably due to being able to deploy/host it is considerably cheaper or just free in some cases. Well, it doesn't handle floating point numbers as well as C#. In fintech or science, you need some absolute precise decimal numbers or scientific notation without jumping through hoops, like you would with J's. Now there are other languages and frameworks that handle this issue well enough too, but my company went with C#/.NET. C. 1. HTTP URL. 2. HTTP URL. Most other languages use the money pattern anyway to handle currency. That's good. I don't see C# as needing one specifically for money anytime soon. Decimal is backwards and forwards compatible for financial standards, at least for now. The image rehab also gets a setback every few years thanks to Microsoft themselves. For example, 2 years ago they tried to remove hot reload from every other OS but Windows. Only due to a big outcry of the open source community they reverted the changes with the excuse of oops, that was an accident, we swear it wasn't intentional, which doesn't really leave a good taste. The sunsetting of V's for Mac might also be seen as a setback. I don't know anything about the hot reload situation, but I could see it being a non-insidious deliberate decision. Hot reload for non-Windows is 10x more work. Only 10% of our devs are non-Windows, so let's not make that investment now or ever. The old motives around selling you a Windows license are largely gone in a world where Windows 10/11 is free. Killing Versus for Mac is a very good decision. It's awful. No one should pay for it in a world where VSC exists. If that was their reason, not saying it is since only Microsoft knows, it wouldn't be a better reason. That would mean they aren't interested into being truly a cross-platform development platform. Which would also generate a setback. I agree, V's for Mac is awful and it's a great decision to kill it off. What's not so great is leaving Mac OS and Linux without official tooling. Xcode is so-so for C#. For example, Xcode only supports IntelliSense for one project at a time. If you have multiple projects in a solution, then you need to switch the IntelliSense between projects. There exists a workaround for this, but then some other useful feature dies off. And the Xcode support is now also closed source, partly. It would have been better if they kept supporting V's for Mac and worked on their Xcode support or another truly cross-platform tool until it is a viable alternative to V's 2022 and then announce the death of V's for Mac. Currently I am forced to use Rider on my MacBook. Startups, who want to save pennies wherever they can, won't like that. That said, Rider is worth every penny lol. Check out the new C# dev kit for VSC. I gave up on natively developing in macOS and bootcamped my MacBook. I'm lucky enough to still have Intel. We have a lot of folks using Parallels. I can make it, or native work. I'm just an old dog. The real bust for me on the native side was actually DB tooling. I'm just too attached to SSMS. I did. Blazor syntax doesn't work, which is a no-go since we use Blazor. The work was done, though. They had it merged. Then they created a pull request to revert it, another setback, the thing they're doing with Omni#. What do you mean? They're not doing anything with Omni# anymore. /s, and normally, I would applaud them for that, because Omni# is so damn buggy. Unfortunately, their replacement is far, far buggier. In fact, buggy is a bit too kind. It just straight up doesn't work. It's as if someone said you are fired if you don't release something right now, and so they uploaded whatever they had in their text editor and hoped it compiled. Unfortunately for us, it did. I wouldn't be so cross about this if they had just rolled the update back until it was fixed, like any responsible engineer would do. But nope. They've chosen to double down on it, as if their ego won't let them admit they fucked up. Now we have a C# plugin that's broken by default unless you manually downgrade it, and it'll remain like this for several months. Well, things like the Versus Code extension going closed source does not show a root to branch commitment to the philosophy. HTTP URL. HTTP URL. Yes, they fold. HTTP URL, but even to get that far shows there must be internal pressure to instigate the extinguish part of the normal MS game plan. Does that mean that in coming years we might see dotnet being embraced by more and more startups once things start becoming clear, especially domination over Java? I have no idea. Phew, I don't know anyone working at a startup here, US, that's using Java, JVM, yes, but I think it's mostly Kotlin. That's also admittedly not a huge sample. I would add that many people do not want to work with a language/ecosystem that isn't primarily open source. Some people want way more control over their tools, and they don't want to rely on third parties to sort out problems that they run into. Traditionally, Microsoft tools have not met that criteria. I think it's a combination of an image problem and a misplaced desire to chase shiny and new rather than focusing on creating shiny and new. I also think there are lots of startups in NA that use dotnet. Microsoft's startup program is amazing and the perks are both high value and very useful. It takes the industry a long time to adapt to new things. It doesn't help that .NET has only earned the status of open source and cross-platform with scare quotes. Oversimplified. 1. For a few years it's been an annual tradition for major .NET FOSS libraries to announce a shift to commercial licensing. That can be bad news to a cash-strapped startup. 1. Should people be expecting to make $1 billion on the backs of free labor? Good question. But as long as that free labor's reliable on other platforms, it's a no-brainer. 2. If you need a desktop app, Microsoft support for Linux doesn't exist and you are at the mercy of FOSS community efforts. 1. Refer to the last paragraph. 3. Other platforms like Java or Node have a longer track record of being open source, without scare quotes, and the core libraries, if commercial, didn't get there in a way that involved pulling the rug out from users. 4. You have to wait until every C-level executive and manager who thinks using .NET means we need Windows servers retires. It is faster to wait for them to retire than it is to teach them new things. 1. Bad news, they train new people to believe it too. I'm still seeing people write incorrect .NET based on things that were myths in VB6. I wouldn't bet that by 2040 the average leadership candidate will have adapted to 2020. Sometimes all it takes to be a good leader is to be stupid enough to make risky decisions without fear. Free open source software. It's slightly different from OSS, open source software. Open source software is a broad category. Originally free as in beer was meant to be implied by it, but eventually people commercialized it and created software that had some kind of commercial licensing but also provided source access and took submissions. So FOSS became a new moniker to emphasize the free part. One reason .NET isn't and can't be as big as Java is people believe its ethos is closer to OSS than FOSS. There could be a long, tiresome argument about that, but I do hear an awful lot more complaining about compensation from .NET maintainers. I believe cross-platforms desktop apps within .NET is now doable with MAUI, but still a solid point as MAUI is very recent compared to Electrons, etc. I'm a Xamarin Forms dev who has to port an app to MAUI soon. MAUI on desktop is a mess. 90% of our work is finding tedious workarounds for things that have worked fine on iOS/Android for years but follow a completely different set of logic on Windows. It is a constant struggle. Support for Mac desktop is through the Catalyst layer. That is meant as a last resort for iOS devs who can't afford to make a native Mac app. Most iOS devs have a poor opinion of this tool because it does a pretty bad job representing a coherent experience. Support for Linux desktop is DIY. MS will happily accept free community labor but is not committed to providing it themselves on any timeline. That's pretty bad. MAUI doesn't even deliver a great experience for a Windows-only app. If you want a cross-platform desktop application, there are better frameworks. It's harder to notice if you start from the perspective of making a Windows desktop app as a new MAUI dev. Then when you run into the bad behaviors on Windows, you think, oh, that's just not how XAML works. Verily I say unto you, usually XAML does work that way and has worked that way for half a decade. MS just cares more about calendar dates than quality in MAUI. Oh damn, yeah okay. Let's hope they improve their cross-platform support within MAUI. Haven't tried it, and to be honest I haven't built many desktop apps, I mostly work in web. And even when I was building mobile apps, I developed them under React Native. Only thing I knew was the lack of support for Linux in MAUI, which isn't really new lol. Most of Linux support comes from the FOSS community and third parties. MAUI seemed so good at first. For years I wrote cross-platform apps in Java and JavaFX. But then with Java 9 they basically abandoned JavaFX. They introduced a module system which broke things. Essential libraries like Controls-FX seem to lose support and still have outstanding breaking bugs, and they removed the native bundling without a replacement for almost 4 years. Not to mention Oracle changing its licensing. Now I use Avalonia and .NET to write cross-platform app. Mostly ignorance in its truest form. A generation of kids grew up with a MacBook, learned Java or Python in college, and never used Windows because of the Bulma issues from 20 years ago. Seriously, a generation of college kids never touched Microsoft products because it was so expensive. They also know nothing but the cloud in terms of infrastructure. Those kids are now founding startups or are lead engineers/hiring managers, and they hire boot campers who are taught 6 months of TypeScript/JavaScript with React that looks pretty but they have no computer science fundamentals. But they can quickly hire dozens of these candidates to get something together to appease the investors. Then either they go out of business, or they get super smart and move to another stack. Source, me, who's rewriting a Python stack for a startup into .NET 8 because Python can't scale is expensive to scale. Python can definitely scale. Reddit, one of the most visited sites in the world, works on Python. So does Instagram. Everything can scale, but it's more about how much money does it cost to scale. Just about any language can scale if you just throw hardware at the issue. The X can't scale argument is usually just ignorance emo. Now X is expensive to scale, okay, that I will buy all day. But throw more servers and more load balancers at the problem, and any language can scale. Microsoft products expensive. Mac is X4 expensive than $XD. Writing code with a non-production ready, dude, and Python is a toy language, you can't be serious with that lol, it's for everyone what doesn't have to learn programming for do something. Base Python does not include a JIT, I think it is basically the only popular programming language these days without one. This has got benefits too. Guido always wanted to keep the base Python codebase simple and JIT would add a lot of complexity to that. OFC The drawback is that Python code is not very optimized, but for the thing that Python was intended for, short-running scripts that are file or network I/O bound, this is not a bad drawback. The lack of JIT is why everyone calls into C++ code instead with Python bindings, as this is the way Python achieves better performance. OFC you are still paying for the binding costs in that case. In any case, if you ever build anything that is going to see any amount of use and is not bound by I/O, you really shouldn't be doing it in Python or you'll saddle yourself and the rest of the company with working around Python's limitations. Seriously, a generation of college kids never touched Microsoft products because it was so expensive. That doesn't track with a logical reality. Apple products have never been cheaper than the Microsoft equiv. In reality, it's a supply and demand problem. Finding and hiring good .NET developers is challenging. Finding and hiring some Python/React developers that can get some stuff done is challenging. I primarily used Java in high school and college. Worked on enterprise Java bin applications after college with awful Java Swing front ends. Constantly had issues with EJB running on JBoss and Wildfly. Tuning performance was a nightmare and a guessing game. Constantly dealt with subtle memory leaks and random server crashes. I had the pleasure of picking the tech stack for the startup I work at in 2015 and decided to objectively compare options. After a lot of experimenting and building basic proof of concepts, I landed on .NET Core. It was DNX at the time, React, React Native, and MS SQL. It was a huge gamble because all three of the frameworks were still basically in their infancy stages compared to now. React Native really only had some basic components and DNX wasn't recommended for production. It was unclear just how widely supported/adopted any of them were going to be. 8 years later, I feel like I won the lottery on those choices. .NET Core has been an absolute pleasure to work with. Visual Studio/Versus Code has come a long way. Azure's UI leaves a lot to be desired, but it integrates so well into everything that the DX is unparalleled. It's difficult to balance all the reasons that go into picking something like .NET Core over Node, Rails, Flask, Spring Boot, etc. Ease of hiring devs with that experience, expected lifetime of support, ease of use, capabilities of the framework, costs to run it in prod, current tech stack of the company, and current experience of people in the company with said options. I think a lot of people either can't objectively evaluate these parameters or simply choose not to. At the end of the day, you can accomplish the same thing with most frameworks. They all have their own unique drawbacks/problems. I've spent so much time with my tech stack, I know it'll be a struggle to transition to something else because now I just know all the pitfalls and best practices with .NET Core. I think most people fall into that same category of using what they have the most experience with, and that's why you don't see as many startups using .NET Core. .NET seems to be very popular in the Netherlands at least. My perspective is that it has to do with the ecosystem and how much control you have over the runtime. I am not a fan of Java as a language or its conventions, however the whole ecosystem is amazing. For example, you need a stream processing framework, boom, you have a lot of choices. In .NET on the other hand, either someone has ported a Java 1 or none exists. Actor Model Framework? Akka.NET was the only option some years ago and it felt like an over-engineered port. Microsoft did push their own actor model frameworks for .NET, but no big community around it. Service Fabric was not even open source in the beginning. Like Java, Python has the same advantage. The ecosystem alone is such a huge factor that it will be difficult to choose. .NET/C# despite its advantages. If you are doing standard web apps or backend processing, sure. .NET will give you a lot more, including performance. But as soon as you do not want to reinvent the wheel and look for a library for something, you will hit the ecosystem limit. P.S. I have worked with .NET the most and do my side projects in .NET. A lot of good answers, but one I think worth saying is that if you want a mature language at this approximate level that compiles to bytecode, Java is both better known outside of MS world and has a compelling argument for having more libraries, especially FOSS ones. C# is less stodgy and not as verbose, but most people don't know that. Most startups aren't interested in enterprise languages, and in fact one of the ways they attract talent is to use more modern tech stacks. Another problem is that Microsoft is terrible at marketing and branding their developer solutions. People are just unaware of what modern .NET, including ASP.NET with minimal APIs, Blazor, Razor Pages, etc., even are. At my last job, a Go/K8s/GCP shop, people didn't even know .NET ran on Linux and thought you had to develop and deploy it to Windows still. I think this goes both ways, though. And based on interviewing for new roles, a lot of the .NET/C# culture is still stuck in an older mindset, using Windows plus MS SQL plus versus deployed to Azure. This is fine, especially if it works for them and their developers, but it also means they aren't really going to be educated on other things and will likely perpetuate the same myths about .NET. I think Microsoft has to do better at building awareness going forward. I think it's also fair to say a large percentage of .NET shops do still run on Windows Server, MS SQL and versus, often with non-existent or appalling DevOps culture. My experience with trying to recruit talent into a predominantly .NET company is they assume you fit that mold and just lose interest. I can't blame them, we were actually that way for a long time as well. We hired people during the shift to cloud/Linux, but we still had a Windows production system that needed to be looked after while that completed. It of course took longer than expected. A lot of them quit because of having to deal with the Windows and legacy .NET side, and I unfortunately have to say I think we also turned a bunch of people off of .NET permanently during this period as well, especially DevOps engineers. We have more sexy languages in the fold now, in particular adding Go, originally for purely technical reasons, really improved the quality of people we could hire. I think there are some places out there that are starting to wake up to the issue of not having a real DevOps culture at .NET shops, and I've had some luck interviewing for some roles recently where I can leverage my cloud and DevOps experience from working at startups with keen interest. Like I mentioned in my earlier post, I think startups consciously or otherwise use tech stack choice to filter out people who aren't like-minded, whereas big enterprises already entrenched in Java or C# don't really care about tech stack, as a sort of statement that some startups do and are really just conservative about change. I think what you described is also a lack of interest and education in Windows Server and its ecosystem due to how niche it's become on the developer side. Image problem and lack of good free tools for development on Linux and macOS. I've said it before, but I think the .NET community really underestimates how negative the effect of bad tooling on Mac and Linux is. Yes, Rider is great, but it's got a price tag. VS Code is capable, I use it as my daily driver, but it is shocking how buggy/quirky the C# support is compared to every other language in VS Code. We will see if this improves now that there seems to be a more serious push to properly support it. All of this is just walls being put in front of someone who just wants to try the language. Compare that experience to most other contemporary languages and you can see how C# is bleeding in this area. The good news is it's a fixable problem. The image problem is much more difficult and will still take many years to repair. I struggle with trying to recruit talented young engineers. They lose interest when they hear C#. Agreed. One of the reasons why Node jumped in popularity as easily as it did is because it's easy to start with for anyone with free tools. I often see the argument, why don't you just pay for Rider to people who are just getting started? If their first experience with dotnet is having to pay a pretty hefty sum of money to have a decent developer experience, they'll just find another language they can use free tools for. Yep. PG took so long to climb up the hill of databases because its tooling sucked for so long. Still not great, but the platform is so solid, people will find ways. VS Code exists. If you're doing business, rider licenses aren't $100K/year, this ain't Adobe. VS Code has a ton of problems with C# and isn't really a viable alternative to VS 2022 or Rider. Yes, I know Rider isn't that expensive. I have Rider and use it as well. Love it. You don't have to convince me. You have to convince the people who finance the startup. That's an uphill battle, especially because of the image problems Microsoft tends to reinforce every few years. This was released a few months ago and significantly improver #CDX in VS Code. HTTP URL. Yep, I'm aware. It doesn't work for Blazor in large projects and breaks a lot. Well, that is true, brother. I, however, can't understand people who ask their organization to buy them licenses unless they're expensive / only used by you at work. I pay for my own Rider license. I can't stand the thought of being stripped of my license after I change my workplace. I use Rider for work, pet projects, scripting, even CTF challenges. Understandable. I have my own Rider license as well and gladly pay for it. My current company has a budget that renews every year you can use for personal tools and/or small hardware like mice, keyboards and all that. So right now that's how I pay for Rider, but I'll keep paying for it myself when I inevitably get a new job one day. There's a startup discount for Rider, and I bet a ton of folks that would want to use it for a startup have a personal license already, which can be used for company work based on their licensing. Also, if a few bucks a month to give your engineers high productivity is a problem, you'll be in for a bad time. We use it. People always look into what tech a company use, but by the end of the day what matters for a company is to be able to dish out products regardless of what tech they use. Stigma and something not talked about enough is Visual Studio Enterprise is pretty expensive once a company meets the requirements of having to use it. It's like $6K a year per developer if I remember right. Compare that to IntelliJ IDEA for something like Spring Boot being only around $500 a year per dev. If I have 25 devs on the team, once we hit 1 million in annual revenue at the startup, I'm looking at a $150K bill just to use versus $13K to use IntelliJ IDEA. You are not locked into versus, you can use IntelliJ, Rider, or VS Code too, because it started as Windows-only framework. As a response to the Java lawsuit, many C# 1.0 features were already in J extensions, for example events, J/Direct, JFC, ComInterop. Nowadays, even with the cross-platform support, many tooling features are only available on Visual Studio proper, for example profiling and graphical analysis of core dump files. The whole dotnet watch drama, where the feature was removed, only to be added after the community went for the pitchforks. The only good alternative to VS outside Windows is Rider, so if one has to be using a JVM stack for .NET development tooling, then better bite the bullet and go with Java/Kotlin/Scala/Clojure. Finally, as we like it or not, Unix has won the server room, so Unix first languages born from the start as FOSS are much more appealing to most startups. We do polyglot project development, and lately on most RFPs in terms of technology stacks being asked for, advocating for .NET-based solutions feels like being on Asterix's village. Well, MS was very Windows-centric for quite a while. Java took a large part of the cake as it was running on Linux back then. You can also add Steve Ballmer in the mix, who made quite some statements back then. It gets better nowadays, especially with the help of Azure, as I see many companies starting to shift their attention to incorporate Azure clouds as they are quite compatible with European laws. So as someone who, very poorly, tried to make a startup using C# as my backend language, I felt the biggest issue was just the amount of time it takes to write code that can meet the needs of the business project. That's not to say C# can't make anything happen, but it's a slower language to write code in than, let's say, PHP or JavaScript. Also, and others have pointed this out, but misunderstanding how cost work if you use a cloud hosting platform can hinder wanting to use C#. I did use Azure to host our app, and my at the time poor understanding of how to control the cost likely caused me unnecessary spending. Me and my friend did abandon the project one because we really just had no idea how to run a business, but if I could do it over, I likely would have chosen a different tech stack as well. I would like to also mention a few important things in that I'm just one person sharing their experience and others will have different opinions. I've also never worked at other startups and only tried to build my own. In the startup I work for, we use .NET for both back-end and front-end, Blazor, and any little desktop apps get done in Avalonia. However, we also write a lot of data, image processing stuff in Python. My personal hard-on for .NET comes from two things: async, await, and the TPL Dataflow library. TPL Dataflow makes it so easy to write a performant concurrent processing pipeline. Python concurrency, on the other hand, always feels like a hack. Likewise, doing a few things in parallel by awaiting a few task.runs makes it trivial to speed up CPU-bound code. Honorable mention is Link. I consult with a lot of startups, and I find that the sort of startup CTO that you often find is some enthusiastic programmer who wants to use the newest, fastest, coolest language. Perhaps Go, Erlang, or Rust. That shoots them in the foot because they don't know the language well enough. Development is slow, it is difficult for them to master, extremely difficult to hire developers, and subsequently outsourcing costs them a fortune. When you are planning your tech stack for your startup, the questions you need to ask: 1. What language does the company know already? 2. What language can the company master quickly? 3. What language can I hire developers easily to scale rapidly? I work full-time in a startup that uses .NET. It works well. But that only happened because it started in Sydney, which has a large .NET community. I'm very active in the Indie Hackers, MicroConf, and #build in public space on Twitter. I love C#, and I have asked the same many times before. I've built an Electron app with a C# backend called DisplayGent, HTTP URL. And I'm also building an open-source, full-stack, standalone .NET job orchestrator called Didact, HTTP URL. I have often wondered why I don't see it more, and I think the top answer on this post addresses it best. My backends are solid though. I use .NET Web APIs with SQL Server and I have zero problems. I have enterprise experience. I think many indie hackers do not. I'll add in my 2 cents. .NET has some great tooling and can be a great ecosystem. But there are a few things to be wary about. The latest with MS pulling versus for Mac is one thing, or their history with UI frameworks. If you don't mind writing in a non-cross-platform UI framework that just needs to run on Windows, WinForms is great. But other than that, you have WPF, WinUI, and MAUI, and I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years they add another one. More on UI. MAUI was built up to be great. As a dev working on a serious MAUI app, it has been a total shit show. It was released half-baked with tons of issues. And more importantly, as much emphasis as they have put on MAUI, I have yet to see Microsoft write one of their own products in MAUI. I really hate to say it, since I have a project in MAUI, I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft kills it in a couple of years and I am left holding the bags on technical debt. One more thing to be wary of, and startups should be conscious of. When you get into .NET, Microsoft has tons of things that make Azure look really attractive. It can be really tempting. But here are some things to consider. Azure is not the cheapest cloud solution out there, and you end up leaning a lot on the nice tooling Microsoft has built to make it easy to deploy your code to Azure. I would caution vendor lock-in. For a startup, this can be attractive because it can make the DevOps side of it really easy. But then you're sorta locked into Azure once you start not liking the bill. Here is a saying we use as half-joke/half-truth in Outshop, .NET Shop: all roads lead to Azure. Maybe the lack of a good, Microsoft-supported, uniform, cross-platform UI could have something to do with it. Yes, it's a very good cross-platform UI. I've used it professionally for several years, and it just works. Which bit are you saying isn't good? For mobile it's probably fine, but it's just lacking so many features for desktop app development that I'd prefer Avalonia or Uno. As someone writing a mobile app with MAUI, it's a shit show. I had an issue pairing the Mac in the latest stable, wouldn't work. Checked the issues on the MAUI repo, someone filed an issue and the response was, "Yay, it's broken, roll back," and it was just closed. We have so many hacks built in because this UI component works well on Android but is half broken on iOS or vice versa. The only thing that has made it bearable is the MAUI Community Toolkit, which helps to fix a lot of the half-baked stuff along with another repo or two that just provides fixes for various things like the keyboard. Much of it is even basic stuff, considering it's pretty much a continuation of Xamarin, that you would think would work, but it doesn't. On iOS, you have to tread lightly on some things because the oat will just completely screw something up. I really want to like MAUI, but I checked it out again a few months ago and it just isn't there yet. It's not very nimble, as it's more geared toward longer-term maintenance at the expense of quick first releases. I still find dynamic languages more nimble for starting projects. Dynamism offers lots of little handy tricks that make strong typers cringe. Yeah, I also have coded in dynamic languages for a very short duration and I did found it cool initially, but going forward dynamic nature does cause unexpected problems. Dynamism gets thrown in garbage and rewritten within months. Fixed it for you, D. Often startups do rewrite their software when they become mature companies, say 5 to 10 years later. Moving fast and breaking things stops being the best strategy. Can't say for sure considering your region might be different, but in India things are like this. Because who did first gain a lot of customers? Java was open source, support multi-system, and created before C#, dotnet. JavaScript is always easier, cheaper, and there are a lot of devs into it. JavaScript and Python both has the biggest pool of junior devs, but it also means it's harder to find good devs. I bet this makes the hiring process more complicated, especially if you're looking for specific skills. I'm a startup co-founder and CTO and we use it for all of our systems. We had chosen for Node.js because it was trendy at that time. Now we regret that decision and wish we had chosen for .NET instead. Is the inability to scale well one of the reasons or some other things? We are a startup. We are using it. If you are looking for startups that hire for lots of entry-level roles, you are pre-selecting for a population that might be making a horrible decision right out of the gate. Maybe this is a spicy take, but in almost all cases, hiring lots of entry-level folks is not the right thing to do for a startup. Interesting. Ever since I switched to .NET development, I noticed .NET-powered startups everywhere. Mostly in back-end servicing and Node.js front-end. But the image it built up in the early framework days will take time to fully erode. Many people dismiss .NET outright without even understanding what .NET is today. My take, I worked in startups before, is that .NET has the perception of being slow and stable to develop, but in STUP you need something x10 on speed, even if it gives you away a 10% instability, as those problems can be solved, mostly of the time, by a bigger/better server to host the app. I don't see how it is slower to develop with. I think .NET Core Plus versus/Rider plus Azure is more productive platform than even Rails or Node, especially for bigger projects. You can certainly move at least as fast as any of those fashionable startup frameworks. Just to clarify, you don't mean .NET is slow, and we are only talking about perception here, right? Slow to develop on, not slow the language itself. For example, if you compare raw with .NET, you can do much more in raw thanks to its magic than in .NET in the same time, assuming you're the same level at both. I don't think that holds true, even after a single month of development on a project. MS has an image issue around open source and multi-platform, both of which have been addressed but hasn't filtered through properly. From my experience, there are two kinds of startups. The technocratic startups who wouldn't be caught dead using a GASP Microsoft product and are running on Linux with whatever the latest fad language is. Bonus points if they solely use things that are less than a year old, because bleeding edge is obviously the only way to go. And the sector insider startups where tech is a hand-waved problem and they use tools they know/are comfortable with, so the whole thing is probably a fancy Excel sheet. .NET seems to be the predominant choice of platform for startups here in the UK. Objectively superior to Java in every way except name. I noticed you said .NET Core, which is 4 versions out of date. Most programmers' knowledge of other platforms is similarly out of date, which is why so many startups make the mistake of choosing back-end .NET plus front-end Angular and wonder why they struggle to find developers who are great at both. My only motive to mention .NET Core was so that no one confuses it with old, bulky and bad. .NET Framework, as I myself was initially confused in this naming mix-up. It's .NET Framework up to 4.8, then .NET Core up to 3.1, then they finally hired someone with mental clarity and named it .NET 5/6/7/8. Wait, that means Net API and front-end Angular is a bad idea? There was a time when .NET had crappy front-end tech. That time has long passed, and today .NET is probably the easiest and fastest way to create modern web pages and SPAs without relying on the disorganized mess that is JavaScript. I worked with .NET Core at a startup and it's one of many reasons the startup failed. We thought .NET Core was portable to Linux and macOS, but in practice, only the language itself is multi-platform and the libraries used may or may not work in other OS. After that I worked in a Node.js/TS/React world and never looked back. Interested to know what libraries didn't work. So far in my experience, luckily I guess, any libraries we needed that had platform dependencies had the dependencies as a separate NuGet package. One of them that I remember was a standard library for encrypting. The code that ran on Windows wouldn't run on Linux because it was using concepts from Windows only. There were problems all over the place though. Never using C# again unless I'm programming in Linux with a Linux IDE. So no longer using .NET day to day. I'm basically programming .NET targeting Linux now, either running locally in Docker or deploying to Azure Linux VMS, because the type of older developers that would be effective with C#/.NET Core in a startup are not interested in working for startups. It's going to be an age thing. I've played that game. %! At that noise. Been burned by too many. Have lots of worthless equity in dead companies and got screwed over by dilution more than once. At %! You pay me in cash and no, I'm not interested in working 80 hours a week for the founder. Yeah, I got offered cash or cash plus stock and chose cash. Not true. I worked in .NET since 2008 and I currently work at a startup. I prefer startups, and I am almost 50. But the anxiety when finances get tight is tough. .NET just isn't very good at prototyping fast. There's a lot of boilerplate and startup costs that are relatively high compared to Ruby on Rails or Laravel. If I'd be starting a company today, I'd definitely not choose for .NET to begin with. That is such an outdated view. Let me find some examples for you. But TL/DR creating a new project and adding a few endpoints takes the same amount of code as J's with Express and is done within several minutes. The real benefit of .NET will shine right after that when you'll need to add logging, traces, Open API spec, Swagger, request validation, guaranteed production of predefined status codes with concrete responses, security, auth, HTTP and DB connections, caching. It will take 3 to 5 times more code and a bunch of third-party packages to implement the same things in J's, Python, Go, while .NET has everything built in and well supported. Which startup costs are you talking about? The cold start of runtime/container? .NET's image is just 30 MB and the cold start is 28 milliseconds. I strongly disagree with this. Compared to Java, PHP and Node.js, it is a lot faster. Whilst you can apply strong architecture with lots of boilerplate, it is not required. Templates are pretty good at getting you productive immediately. Combined with other tooling like ORM, code generators, one-click deploy and Azure integration, you can get something useful very quickly. The whole premise of .NET from the beginning has been rapid development of line of business apps. Now with Blazor it is next level again. It reminds me a lot of Meteor.js, which has been putting a mobile app for a specific purpose into use in 4 hours. $5 DigitalOcean container is $5 no matter what you run on it. No, it can be free, especially for a startup. There are even plugins for Vim, if you don't want IDEs or VS Code. Also, JS and Python teams purchase products from JetBrains too, WebStorm and PyCharm. Rider is basically the same price, but not required for .NET development. Because it costs more, and gives nothing of value return for the higher cost, development time. Almost anything you can build in .NET I can build in Bun, Node or Laravel in much less time. And I say that with 15 years of .NET experience and half that in Java, script/PHP. More and more are using it for web API side of things. Worked at several startups over the years who were all on .NET and or .NET Core when it became available. Not sure what your sample size is, but I'm still being contacted about startups needing .NET developers. Yes, I see many people mentioning how it is popular in Europe, specifically UK. What I said is based on my observations here in India. What benefits from .NET compared to Java with Spring Boot framework? Less magic, more features, faster, clean, explicit and better language. You don't need to use a decorator for async lol. Why should I pick Java with Spring? Spring is solving Java lack of features. If they leave the market, Java die terribly. Less code, faster, sometimes much faster, builds, 7 seconds on 200 kloc, simpler debug, much less dependencies hell, more performant runtime, less files in general. JVM projects require all sorts of config files, simpler Dockerfile, faster cold start, 30 milliseconds, smaller Docker image size, 30 MB. There could be other benefits too. A lot of the comments resonate with my experiences. One thing I'd add is that if you're creating a tech startup, you're probably passionate about tech and probably want your employees to be more on the passionate side. C# has become a wonderful language, but your labor pool is probably going to skew towards people who learn the technology as a stepping stone into the corporate world rather than people who learn the technology because they're into it. Before Python was so trendy, no one in the established corporate world of note was using it, so people who went out of their way to learn it were proven uber geeks or something to that effect, great employees for ambitious new startups. 1. .NET is associated with MSFT. Startup developers, are they running MFST on their machines? I imagine a large majority would be using Mac, and the remainder, a Linux distro. The diehards might be using Arch. Are these the types of people who would run to C# and Maui, Avalonia? Or maybe Blazor? Or are they going to run into the arms of Rails, Next.js or some JS framework du jour? This is due to a lot of startups having untrained to barely trained developers that write in toy language of that 6 months or JavaScript and the latest toy frameworks. It isn't maintainable nor will it scale. They don't care as long as they can get their next round of funding. I don't think anyone doesn't understand OOP at this point. It's a matter of OOP causing more harm than good in a lot of applications it's used in. Sure, it was interesting 20 years ago and it's nice to have a little inheritance when you need it, but then you get these old legacy apps written by generations of autists, all adding their own messy layers of inheritance to every object when sometimes all you need is a simple function to get the job done. Most people just want to see instant results, and having multiple ways to shoot yourself in the foot with threads doesn't sound that great. C# equals corporate dinosaur of Microsoft. They had very bad developer relations in the past, but it's improving now. There are a lot of startups that use C#, but not the exciting ones. You're a startup. Using corporate stuff is anathema to startup culture. I built a product for my startup in .NET. I knew I was going to get funny reactions from other startup devs. I was at a tech mixer and this guy laughed at me and asked why I would ever use .NET when I told him my stack lol. How did it turn out then? Do you regret choosing it? About community. .NET community, if you are using C#, .NET, F#, or anything running with .NET, you are at the right place.